Okay, so I'm going to talk about agriculture and adaptation in North China. So this kind of offers us an opportunity to think about some of the things we've been talking about. So democratic deliberation, or the inside-outside binary or moral reasoning in adaptation. Think about them in an authoritarian context and what that actually means. So what I'm talking about today is not really necessarily a study of adaptation in practice, because China has been quite slow to develop its adaptation policy. It's been much quicker to develop its mitigation policy. So what I want to consider is really the current environment for governing adaptation in China, and ask a specific question. So how well do China's current adaptation policies actually reflect the challenges of adapting small-scale agriculture to climate change? So how am I in a position to do that? Well, for the past 4 years, I've been studying the vulnerability of small-scale apple producers in North China to climate change. My research findings suggest that these farmers are highly vulnerable, particularly to increased water stress, and also that for various reasons they are not adapting well, and in some cases they're actually not even coping with this increase in water stress. So as I've come to kind of look at the adaptation framework in China, I've been reflecting on what this policy environment means for those farmers, and how well it kind of maps onto their challenges, how well things have been set up to actually assist them in the short and longer term. So I'll briefly introduce you to China's adaptation policy, and then I'll kind of go through some of the insights from my fieldwork to talk about to critique that policy environment. So if we start with institutional arrangements for adaptation in China, I should say initially that the state will be central to adaptation in China, much as it is central to everything else in terms of policy making in China. So there is going to be a very limited role for non-state actors, for civil society actors. So in terms of the state, you've got the National Development and Reform Commission, that is the key institution responsible for analysing the impacts of climate change and developing kind of central government adaptation strategies and policies. Then you've got the relevant line ministries that will feed into that process, and that is replicated down the governance scale at the provincial level, and as far as I can tell, it's not yet replicated at the prefectural and county level, but it will be sometime in the future. In fact, local governments are going to play a significant role in implementing these higher level policies that are coming through at the moment. Local governments in China are increasingly responsible for delivering things like education, health, social welfare initiatives, and all sort of environmental protection initiatives as well. So if we look at some of the key documents, I'm just going to skip through these pretty quickly. You've got the initial NatCom, the second NatCom, and then you've got the white papers that kind of come out every year, and they sort of just report on what's been done already. Just what you need to kind of know about these documents briefly is that they talk very generally about impacts at the sectoral scale for agriculture. They focus pretty much only on the major grain crops, so talking about rice, wheat and corn. And they understand impacts very much in terms of yield reductions, and that's it. So there's not really a discussion of impacts at the household level or impacts at the sort of individual level. Then in 2013, China released its first national climate change adaptation strategy, which is unfortunately not available in English yet. So it starts to get a little bit more specific. So you've got some guiding principles around adaptation. It outlines some key adaptation measures. So in relation to agriculture, you've got these things like building more water storage, building more irrigation capacity, using heat and drought tolerant varieties, or adjusting kind of regional cropping patterns, and then some things like expanding the scope of agricultural insurance, of which there is virtually none in China, and kind of skills training for farmers. This strategy also identifies a few ecological zones, and there are particular tasks for adaptation in these zones. One of them is the Loess Plateau, which is in North China, and that's where my field sites are. And here you've got things like erosion control, the Grain for Green program, which is an existing land degradation program which closes off sloping land to productive use. So farmers can lose the productive use of that land, but they are offered compensation for that loss. You've got building dams, terracing land, and also resettlement, which is a really interesting one, and I'll come back to that. Okay, so with reference to the experience of the small-scale apple producers in rural Shanxi, what can we say about these kind of current policies and measures? So I've got 4 points and we'll see how far I get through them. The first problem is that agriculture is positioned as a relatively homogenous sector in this kind of policy discourse. It's framed only in terms of grain production, the major grain crops, and as a percentage, impacts as a percentage of grain yield reductions. This is a problem because China's agriculture is not homogenous. It is increasingly diverse and regionally specialised. Farmers are shifting more and more into higher value, labour-intensive crops rather than land-intensive crops, particularly fruit and vegetable production. So the vulnerability of and the adaptation needs of these systems are going to be very different. But there's no recognition of this in these documents. So the farmers that I work with are totally reliant in terms of their income on their apple orchards. There's very little diversification in their livelihood systems. Now, apple trees have different water needs to grain crops. They're more sensitive to water stress. These are perennial crops, so if you have, a drought situation in one year, it's not just about the impact in that year, it's about the sort of ongoing impact on the health of those trees. So, the second issue, it doesn't appear that these policies have been developed with any kind of in-depth assessment of vulnerability and its social drivers. So, what drives the vulnerability of small-scale farmers in North China? Who is more or less vulnerable and why? These are questions that are not really addressed at all. And it's here where the repackaging of existing environmental management and rural development, poverty alleviation measures becomes quite problematic because you don't actually have an understanding of whether they're going to assist farmers. So I'll give you one example, and that is resettlement. So resettlement comes up as an adaptive measure for these ecologically sensitive zones like the Loess Plateau. But in my study, resettlement is a driver of vulnerability. So households that have been resettled in this poverty resettlement program are more vulnerable than non-resettled households because of the impact that resettlement has on land holdings and the impact that it has on financial capital in terms of the debt that you incur as a result of resettlement. So by not assessing vulnerability first and by repackaging these measures as adaptation, you kind of leave wide open the possibility for maladaptation. The third point is that many of the adaptation measures outlined in these documents are kind of top-down, large-scale engineering type big technical interventions. So things like changing the cropping pattern at a regional scale, replacing crop varieties, building water resource infrastructure, terracing land. And that will kind of come as no surprise to anyone who knows anything about how environmental management in China takes place. But the problem with this approach is that it's not very well attuned to the reality of the sector. So that goes back to the mapping of the sector and the understanding of agriculture as a sector. So agriculture in China is still overwhelmingly small scale, it's household based, household land tends to be quite fragmented. Some villages are really quite remote from any sort of town centre. So how are you going to deliver measures like this on a large scale? And that kind of raises the issue as well of payment. These are going to be extremely expensive things if you're dealing with not consolidated land, but this kind of dispersed agricultural sector. If you want to intervene into cropping boundaries or cropping patterns, how are you going to do that for perennial crops? So these are much longer term investments. Are you going to go through and replace all that root stock? That's kind of 6 to 8 years of lost income that farmers would have to crop, or you'd have to compensate them for. Okay, so the last, have I got time?
We've got about 4 minutes. 4 minutes, yeah.
Cool. All right. So the last point is about the role of local governments and trying to make the point that local governments in China are actually not very well placed to enable adaptation. So there's two elements to this. The first is that China obviously is a hybrid party state. The central government has controls in place to control the behaviour of local officials. Those incentives mean that local officials respond to the priorities of the central state. They don't necessarily respond to the priorities of their constituents, and you couldn't really even call them constituents because this is not sort of a democratic system. From what I know from my fieldwork about how local officials go about poverty alleviation and rural development activities, I can tell you that they're not very responsive to the needs of farmers. They are much more responsive to maximising their own benefits within this system of political control, which means seeking to meet targets and get promoted and get out of those agricultural areas. So related to that is this problem of local governments building what we call political achievement projects. So these are projects like large-scale irrigation in particular villages. The local government can say on paper that they've met the targets that were necessary, but you go and talk to farmers and they say, in a severe drought, we don't use these pipes because there's no water. So they're not kind of addressing the social and environmental drivers of water scarcity. They're just producing these products and saying on paper that it's done, but it doesn't actually benefit farmers. The second element of the kind of position of local governments is their weak position in the fiscal system, in China's fiscal system. So if you're talking about local governments in largely agricultural areas, you'll find that they are severely in debt because they have quite large expenditure responsibilities, but they don't have a lot of revenue and they don't have a lot of control over that revenue. And the other element of that system is that local governments are reliant on higher level fiscal transfers coming down from the central government for them to actually fund any of this stuff. So they're highly constrained, they're politically weak within this system, and the National Adaptation Strategy talks about channeling funding for adaptation through existing financing mechanisms. So to me that means that adaptation financing is going to flow through this fiscal system, which is quite deeply problematic. So, in response to this question, how well do China's adaptation policies reflect the challenges of adapting small-scale agriculture to climate change? Very poorly at the moment. China's adaptation policy is inaccurate in how it maps agriculture as a sector. It does not adequately understand vulnerability and its social drivers, and so therefore it's not really surprising that many of the adaptation measures that are proposed don't match the needs of farmers particularly well. And the last point is that the actual mechanism for adaptation, for enabling adaptation, is quite a flawed mechanism. So that's it. Thanks.